Association panel on the role of corporate America in promoting racial justice. I'm Olivia Carville, I'm a reporter at Bloomberg, and I'm on the board of NIFWA, and I'm going to be moderating tonight. I'm very pleased to welcome our two guests. John Streur is the president and chief executive of Calvert Research and Management, which is the oldest and biggest socially responsible investing firm in the world, with over 23 billion in assets under management. And financial journalist and author Andrew Ross Sorkin doesn't really need an introduction to a group of financial reporters, but he is a leading voice on Wall Street and corporate America for the New York Times and for CNBC. Like many organizations, the past few months has given us an opportunity to reflect on our own blind spots. And it is not lost on me that tonight's discussion is about racism and diversity, and we don't have any people of color speaking. This panel was originally about the rise of corporate social responsibility, but we decided to focus it more heavily on racial issues in light of recent events. We've already got future panels in the works to continue this important conversation. Andrew and John are both experts in their fields, and we're really lucky to have them join us tonight to talk about how the death of George Floyd has sparked a racial reckoning inside corporate America. So for my first question, I want to throw it to you, John. In a recent blog post I read, you wrote that ending racism in America is the responsibility for corporations. I'd like you to start off by just expanding on this idea. How much of the responsibility to end racism falls on corporate America, and why?
Well, thank you. And really a privilege to be here with everybody this afternoon or this evening in the case of the East Coast. First, why is anything the responsibility of a company? What are they responsible for? Even under the old school mentality of the business of business is business, corporations have to think about the stability of the overall system, the health of the overall system. And even under that mentality, we understand that racism in America causes the entire economic system to underperform. And certainly, we understand from our own country and from societies around the world, the problems when inequality, either just economic inequality or racial inequality, reach a certain level, the system destabilizes, it underperforms. So I think we're justified in making the statement that ending racism is a responsibility of businesses, even strictly from an economic perspective. I think then from the perspective of, is this something that businesses should do? Do they have a moral obligation to do that? Does society expect companies to do that? What is the role of the corporation in society? Clearly, in our current form of capitalism, we have essentially given that authority and responsibility over to corporations. The legal system, the regulatory requirements, the disclosure requirements really indicate to me, and I think a cool reading of it, we've given that trust and that responsibility over to corporations in the United States. We aren't asking our elected officials, we are not asking our government to create equality of opportunity or to end racism. So I think from many different perspectives, we're fully justified in making the statement that it's the responsibility of companies to end racism in America.
And Andrew, I'd love for you to jump in here. Like, what do you think the responsibility is for corporations? Because obviously there's an opposing school of thought with the Milton Friedman ethos that a company's responsibility is just to maximize the profits for their shareholders. What kind of a responsibility do you think corporations have right now? Oh, and you're muted. Andrew, you're muted. We can't hear you. Can anyone hear him?
No.
You're muted.
Unmute. Hi, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Sorry. Look, I think unfortunately, I think the answer is complicated. I think we all have a moral duty individually. I think the question is, do corporations have that duty? I could make the case, as John just did, that they do. but I think even if you were to read through the latest Business Roundtable document that many of the biggest companies in the country signed, which really talked about the sort of various constituents that they want to serve beyond strictly the shareholder, I still think it's going to be a very difficult, a difficult road ahead. And so while I think that corporate leaders individually, as I said, feel that responsibility, some of them feel it more than others, and some don't feel it at all, and some are doing a lot of marketing at the moment. The fundamental question of, is the role of the corporation to be diverse? I would like to think yes. I think that the business incentive argument is probably more persuasive insofar as I think you can look at a lot of the research, and John can speak to the research better than I can, but that having a more diverse workforce on the whole seems to produce better results. Mm-hmm. That's not a moral argument, that's a performance argument. And I think that for better or worse, to get to the place that I think all argument want to get to, we're also going to have to make the performance argument a successful one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, we've seen before, like Americans taking to the streets to protest against racial inequality. It's not like this is something new. And largely in earlier times, corporations have remained silent. But this time it's different. We've seen companies from Nike to Google to Tesla to Facebook come out in solidarity with Black Lives Matter movement. Why do you think corporate America is getting involved now? I'll flick to you, John.
Well, you're right, it's different. We've seen the beginnings of this really back prior to the Trump administration coming in. If you go back to the Religious Freedom Bill that Indiana tried to pass when Mike Pence was governor of Indiana, Salesforce came out and said, hey, we'll pay all of our employees in Indiana a stipend to move out of the state if they want to. So even Walmart spoke out on that when the governor of Arkansas talked about a religious freedom bill, which was really code for an anti-LGBT rights legislation. So I think this isn't the beginning of it. This isn't the first time that we've seen corporations begin to use their voice and respond to what they need to do to make their employees feel comfortable working there. And if you just do the math, and I think just going back to Andrew's comments, I think, Andrew, you said, hey, we've got to make the performance case. If we're going to lay this as a responsibility of corporations, or if we're going to really understand this in terms of why corporations are doing it, we better put numbers to it and think about the performance case. Let's do the numbers. We've got a country with 14% of the population is Black. We've got about 18% Hispanic, 1.5% Indigenous. We've got high single digits Asian American. So if you just want to be a great place to work and you want to draw on the complete labor pool, just draw on the complete labor pool, you've got to create well-being for a diverse workforce. Add to that the fact that a high percentage of your white employees care about these issues, and you're just simply running a business. I don't care if the CEO cares or not. They've got to take action to make it clear this is a safe place to work. They can create well-being for the entire population. So I would just say the country's becoming more diverse. More and more people care about the issue. And if you want to be able to draw the complete labor pool, you have to be able to create the environment to employ a diverse team. And we can keep going because educational attainment is going up across those demographics. Educational attainment amongst women is going up versus men across all of those demographics. So there's all sorts of reasons you can look at the data and say a company needs to address the issue in order to be able to draw on the right labor pool. Simple as that.
You go, Andrew.
Well, I was just also going to add, though, in terms of why now, beyond the tragedy, worse than a tragedy of the George Floyd killing, I think that there's something very fundamental that's changing in corporate America as a function of employees, and that's the democratization of management. And I think this stems back to really 3, 4, 5 years ago, in large part what happened in Silicon Valley and the role of social media. Never before have employees been as vocal and been allowed to be as vocal as they have before, oftentimes at odds with management. You could make the argument that 20, 30, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, when unions were more powerful, you had employees who were able to come out and speak out on certain issues, not necessarily on race, but on other issues. And then we had a whole period where the unionization, if you will, has, as we all know, been relatively decimated in this country. But I would make an argument, and we can all argue about the terribleness and a hellscape that is Twitter and Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg and all of it. But if you really think about the voice that social media has given employees to speak out on these issues with power, I think that has actually changed the dynamic and forced the issue with managements that before could stifle that speech and now can't.
What about the role of the rise of socially responsible investing as well? We've kind of seen this move from the margins to the mainstream in the last couple of years, and ESG is now a well-known term in corporate America, and it wasn't, say, 10 years ago. How much is this like riding on a wave of social responsibility as well?
Well, let me go to that in a second. If I could, I want to just respond to a concept Andrew brought out, which is the kind of interconnectedness and democratization of management. I would add to that the fact that the fundamental work of the United States economy has completely shifted from manufacturing to intellectual capital. So your workers mean something very different to you today than they did 15 or 20 or 30 years ago. So as a result of that, I think the way companies manage people has really, really changed. And I think that enables the democratization. And I think social media also enables that democratization. To your question, is this heavily related to responsible investing? It's a system. So investors are looking for long-term value creation from these companies. Investors understand that these are real issues that impact corporate performance. And so the reason that investors, in many cases, the reason that investors are talking to management about these issues and dealing with these issues is because they're concerned about a company's ability to manage these exposures, to manage these risks. And as an investor, we want to understand how good management is at dealing with this issue internally. Do they actually have systems in place to manage a diverse workforce? And frankly, yeah, so I do think that it's very relevant, but I want to be clear, it's not the investor that is saying to the company, hey, we want you to do good. It's the investor who is saying, this matters to your performance, and we want to understand how you're managing this issue. I think that is the voice that has the attention of the board. And I think I was on a call today with one of the big four banks, and we were very clear to bring the numbers to the table so we could talk in economic terms to the organization, as opposed to coming to them and talking to them about doing the right thing. Of course, we think it's the right thing. It's unfair, not to create opportunity for all people. We deeply believe that. But I think what has made a difference is we now have the tools to come to the organizations that we're dealing with and show them the numbers and drive it from a financial perspective.
Right, so making that economic argument. And how much of that would also be related to companies wanting to maintain a competitive edge with consumers and with employees who want to ensure that where they work and the businesses that they buy from maintain the same values as them?
Well, we of course, that's a leading question, Olivia. We agree with that, and companies understand that they're impacting their reputation both as an employer, they're impacting their reputation as a place to do business. whether you're dealing in consumer product or retail.
Mm-hmm.
You can just see that and how all these companies are reacting to the current situation. So it has become something that matters more and more. And just going back to this concept that I put on the table a minute ago about how workers are performing a completely different role for corporations than they were when we were a manufacturing economy. Look at the equity market. 75 to 80% of the value of US equities is tied up in intangibles. A lot of that's tied up in brand. So a good company, a good board is really tuned into reputation risk and the impact on the brand. And so in a very real sense, we do have a compensation system that should work in this case. But as investors, we need to make that link for these companies.
Mm. And Andrew, it looked like you wanted to jump in on something there.
Well, the only thing I wanted to mention on the ESG front is I think that there's an overlay of ESG, or at least the conversation that's been happening in America, which I do think is an important one that I think has hopefully infected, and I say infected in a good way, the way managements are thinking about the argument that within the investing world, ESG has become quote unquote productized and has become a bit of and I'm curious what John thinks. I'm worried that ESG is becoming a bit of a marketing gimmick for a number of funds and investors out there. And then we're going to be appealing to the marketeers, if you will. So while I think the intent of ESG is fabulous and been generally supportive of it for the most part in what I've written over the years, I'm worried it may get taken to an extreme or is being taken to an extreme without real data and metrics behind it. And so it's very hard for me to sort of use the ESG phrase. I'm worried is being co-opted by lots of people to mean a lot of different things.
Do you want to respond to that, John?
Yeah, I agree with you, Andrew. I think that's right. We at Calvert, we don't use the term ESG in any of our products. We don't do that. We think of it as responsible investing. Our first objective is maximize returns. Our second objective is essentially to make the world a better place. But we know if we can't use data to link these issues to the financial performance of the companies we've invested in, it really shouldn't be on our radar screen. It's not our business, right? So I agree with that, and I do think there are challenges ahead for the term ESG. At the same time, I think that there is a group of investors, and we certainly find ourselves, we think, at the forefront of that, who are working hard to connect these issues, whether it's climate change, whether it's waste, whether it's basic human capital management, or whether it's equality, racism, diversity, et cetera, working hard to analyze those issues to understand the impact on corporate performance. And we all know that how companies manage their people really matter to the company's performance. Nobody's going to debate that. Makes a big difference. And so I think these are very real issues. They matter to corporate performance. I completely agree that ESG is becoming a buzzword and it's getting dangerous.
The other thing that I just wanted to raise, and I'm curious, actually, maybe John can speak to this as well, is whether ESG or a lot of the themes that are coming out of this are what might be described as peak market issues. You look at Delta. Delta came out very proudly and happily right before the pandemic began. When we didn't know the pandemic was really here, that happened in China, but they came out and said they were going to start spending $100 million a year to buy up carbon credits every year for the next 10 years. So they're going to spend $1 billion. Now they're a demonstrably challenged business. They're not going to be able to do that anymore. And so there are some of these things that I think are, all of which are very, very important. But when the economy is going spectacularly well, you can do a lot of things. When it's more challenged, it becomes more complicated. And I imagine when we get into the third and fourth quarter, even of this year, because I don't think we've experienced it, at least in the markets thus yet, and businesses haven't really felt it for lots of reasons, and we can talk about it even despite the pandemic. I think that some of the efforts that we've heard about and heralded may get undone or unraveled in certain ways.
Mm.
That's different than the diversity issue that we're talking that we started this.
But just on that topic,
elements to it that.
Oh, sorry. We're losing you slightly, Andrew. But just on this topic, last year there was the roundtable where 181 CEOs pledged to lead their companies for the benefit of all stakeholders rather than just shareholders. And this idea in and of itself received blowback as like a way for companies and chief executives to carve out a lot of latitude to explain away profit loss or say that they're prioritizing ESG when they had a bad quarter, for example. So who should be responsible for holding companies accountable for the ESG claims that they make?
Well, look, I think the media is going to do that, and I think investors are going to do that. I think it's going to be very complicated because, look, I was on the phone with a CEO last week who was grappling with the idea that a signer, by the way, of the Business Roundtable document, who is effectively deciding whether they're going to lay off employees or whether they're going to cut their dividend. Mm. Which one should you do? Who do you have the compact with? Mm. I think a year or two ago, the answer would have been you're going to cut your employees. Today, I think you've signed that document and you're worried, A, that you're going to be a hypocrite, B, that you may need those employees back in the future. So there's some real issues there. At the same time, what's the compact with the investor? What's the compact with the pensioner who bought the stock because of the dividend? Now, they knew that the dividend could be at risk too, of course. So I think that's why I said it's not to me, so simple, even though unfortunately as the media, we often want to make it very simple. So that's the other complicated part about this.
Right. Did you want to jump in on that, John, or should we move on?
Yeah, I think it's the board's responsibility to hold management accountable for having made the claim in the first place, mm-hmm. And then for implementing on it. And there have been some shareholder resolutions that were filed on companies that made that claim to ask, okay, what did you do? Show us what you changed in your corporate charter. Show us anything in your governance system that you changed. Tell us what you actually did. And the response pretty uniformly was, guess what? We were already an outstanding company. We just happened to say these things. We didn't need to do anything different. That's been the uniform response. But I think it's the board's responsibility to make sure that management balances these issues, makes the right decision, and does an excellent job. I think the Business Roundtable statement was a waste. I hate to say this, but companies using their voice, that's a positive. It's sort of cheerleading. We want to see companies that are successfully navigating the changes that society is placing at their doorstep. So when you think about what does it mean to be an excellent company that I want to invest my clients' money into? Well, I need a company with a management and a governance structure that can navigate its product cycle, and it can navigate the social changes that are always happening around us and properly balance these issues. And right now, we're going through a really significant and ever increasing speed of social change. And I think that's really the issue that we're talking about today is which companies can actually navigate this well and do what society is now expecting them to do and asking them to do. For whatever reason, we're at the point where the Supreme Court can make a decision and say, guess what? The Trails of Tears started with a promise, and we're going to keep that promise. And the eastern half of Oklahoma is going to be governed as a sovereign entity under the control of a half a dozen indigenous tribes, right? We're at a point in time when a lower court can uphold a decision that Energy Transfer Partners needs a proper environmental assessment of Dakota Access Pipeline. And we're at a point in time where people of every walk of life, I'm in a rural community, overwhelmingly Trump country. The town I'm closest to is a town of about 50 people. We needed to drive through that town about 2 weeks ago. Blow me away. There's a Black Lives Matter protest of all white rural people with signs saying Black Lives Matter. For whatever reason, this country is going through some kind of a unique social change. Of course, at Calvert, we love it. This is our time. We support these issues. Question is, which of the companies that we invest in can actually navigate this well? And I think that's the issue. Where is the information that allows us to understand what choice should that CEO have made, Andrew? Should he have laid off? Or I assume it was a he, 86% of them are. Should he have laid off those 25,000 people or whatever the number was? Or should he have cut the dividend? What tools does he have to make that decision? And how is that board, how is that governance structure set up to analyze that?
We've seen a lot of companies making some significant policy changes in recent weeks. Like Sephora, for example, is now dedicating 15% of its shelf space to products from Black businesses. Or Adidas has announced that 30% of its new hires are going to be Black or Latino, for example. But what are some of the best examples that you two have seen of actions that corporate America has taken that you think are actually going to move the needle beyond just basic lip service?
Andrew?
I don't have actually really great examples to identify by company. John May, to me, the most interesting efforts that I've seen in the past several weeks, frankly, are not the companies that have come out with big hiring targets. So, for example, and I should say NBC Universal, one of my many parents, has put a 50% diversity target for the company just in the past 2 weeks. You saw it. You just mentioned a couple of the others, and I think those are great ideas. I think the more interesting efforts that I've heard about and seen are training efforts at the hiring efforts at the very beginning, meaning out of school, efforts to create pipelines. Efforts to build systems. Now, some people will say that's not fast enough to make this happen the way people want it to. But I do think that sometimes the big target, which I think is great because it sort of encourages and creates a vision for what we ultimately want, also creates some unrealistic expectations of what we need to do and how quickly we can actually get there, despite, I think, the best intentions.
Mm-hmm.
Olivia, one thing I would point out, and I don't have the data at my fingertips, but we were already beginning to see an increasing percentage of new corporate directors coming from women, and also in a smaller way coming from people of color. So there's a small trend that was beginning before this. I think that trend will accelerate. So I think we're going to come into kind of the next annual general meeting cycle. We've got a year until that really plays out. So I know there are things going on at the board level to find ways to either refresh boards or to make sure that new board members bring diversity. I think we're going to see a pickup there. A second thing that and I agree with Andrew's sentiment, which is, I don't want to paraphrase Andrew, but kind of not much, right? Neither one of us really raised our hand and said, well, I've got 10 great examples of amazing things companies are doing to solve a problem. So not much. I think the first step, and what we're asking for companies to do, is to make public their EEO1 survey data. So the first thing, and from an investor's point of view, let me see what's going on inside of your company. Like, tell me the differences throughout your company in terms of who has what job and how much they're making. It's just show me. You've got the data, you give it to the EEOC, make it public. Only about 14% of companies give you anywhere close to that kind of information. So that's what we're talking to the big bank about today. And I think that is something that is happening internally. There's a lot of debate going on right now inside of companies about should we provide a little bit more transparency regarding what our workforce looks like. Investors, and we had a bunch of investors on that call behind us, are saying we need this information in order to understand the risk level in the baseline at your company. So you've got to give it to us. And I know there's a debate going on because we're talking to a lot of companies about it. So I think that's happening, and we certainly believe we'll get some action between now and this time next year on transparency.
Okay, John, I just want to jump on something that you said earlier about you're seeing a rising number of women and people of color kind of coming up in leadership positions in the company or ending up in on the executive team. And a lot of the women who are people of color seem to land in chief diversity roles, like chief diversity officers inside companies rather than CFOs or CEOs. And I read a really interesting opinion piece the other day where a chief diversity officer who is a woman of color, she talked about how often other women of color are hired into these chief diversity roles. And she said that they're then ignored, undermined, and attacked for trying to change the corporate culture. A quote from her piece said, "Chief diversity officers are often brought in to respond to an existing problem, to clean up an organization's image, or publicly signal a commitment to diversity and equity that may not actually exist inside that company." So how can we read through the BS if on the surface we get a press release from a company saying, hey, look, we're making all the right moves towards being more inclusive and more diverse. We've just hired a woman of color into the chief diversity role here.
Yeah. So I respond. I didn't get completely clear on what you're looking for here, but I think it's true that a lot of companies have hired a Black woman as CDO who doesn't report to the CEO and who doesn't have a direct line into the executive committee or direct line into the board. And that's not going to work, right? That's a pretty powerful signal within a company that this isn't really coming from the top. And I think that's a mistake. By the way, you mentioned, I think you mentioned Adidas, and you told a story about 30%. Well, they flubbed it the first time, right? That was their second effort. And they parted company with the only woman on their board, by the way, who was their head of HR, who got tagged with the problem. Just observe that in addition to their commitment. So how do we see through that? I think we have to look for things that companies are actually putting in place to accelerate progress of skilled people of color in the organization. So in addition to saying, I want to see who's got what job, what the numbers look like, and I've been able to figure out what your board looks like by looking at pictures and that sort of thing. What else do we want to know? What do you have in place to accelerate development in the organization so that we aren't waiting 10 years or 7 years to see the middle level and the senior level of management get to 18, 20% people of color and or Black and a higher number of people of color. So those specific programs are important to see and to get reporting on. That's actually a conversation that investors are having with companies. So what we don't want is to just see companies say stuff, make grand statements, or put a person on the board. What we do want is to see management do this successfully. So we want to get the benefits of, as an investor, we want to get the benefits of diversity. We want that financial kick. And we want to see opportunity created to change society, because we think that we're going to have a more stable market. Andrea, you used a statement earlier, is this kind of peak market? Maybe it is, but we're really interested in a system solution that will drive long-term value creation. In order to do that, this has to be done by expert management, and there are more markers in terms of what is that company really doing that can tell you if they're going to do this successfully or if they're not going to do this successfully. That's the conversation.
Okay, and Andrew, I'd love to come to you next, just on that topic of grand statements that John brought up. Initially, this uprising was about police brutality, but it's since morphed into a national conversation where we're seeing businesses being called out for a lack of diversity and profiting from anti-Blackness. In a recent New York Times op-ed, we heard about how in early June, brands started to get nervous about this, and they rushed to release statements of solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. Even companies like the cereal brand Kellogg's issued a statement. So I wonder, do you think that companies like Kellogg's, when they issue these statements, are they really adding to the dialogue at all? Or do you think they're just interacting because they're afraid of being called racist if they don't speak out?
I hate to say, I don't know enough about the Kellogg example to speak to it specifically, and I don't know what their intent was and what's in their heart. And I
What
don't
about
know
more generally?
but I would say generally, look, I think we're also living in, I don't love the phrase, but we are living in a bit of a cancel culture right now. And I think people are very anxious about how they're perceived, what they say, how they say it. And I think you can see lots of examples where the pendulum has swung too far or not enough in all sorts of ways. And I'll say even this conversation, I have my own anxiety about, because I don't want to say the wrong thing. I mean, I think we're at a point where that is a very real issue. And so I think that feeling is a feeling that I think a lot of companies have. Interestingly, talking about cancel culture, what is interesting is when people haven't found the company's statement to be genuine, where people actually think that it is out of fear, they will get canceled for that too. So it's a very unique moment in terms of how these issues are articulated to the public.
Mm-hmm. And at this point, I'd also just like to welcome any of our audience to write in. If they have written questions, we can pick them up in the chat function. But so next question, I want to talk about how over the past decade, we've seen businesses spend billions of dollars trying to get more underrepresented minorities into top jobs. This is something that they've attempted to do for quite some time now. But for African Americans in particular, these efforts have just failed. There are fewer Black CEOs in Fortune 500 companies today than 5 years ago, and fewer Black executives on Wall Street. So why do you think these diversity efforts are failing? John, if you want to answer that first.
Yeah, that's a fair question, and it extends across industries. It's not something that you can look at and just explain in the finance sector. I think the lack of expertise in terms of really creating and devoting real resources to the issue is at the heart of it. So we noted the characteristics that you've just articulated, Olivia. You know, we conducted a research project beginning about 2 years ago to understand the drivers of inequality and really try to understand this issue. What was wrong with the system? Where was the system's failure? And of course, it's no surprise that we found the issue goes back before the company, and it exists in access to opportunity, exists in access to education, it exists in access to a healthy place to live. There are a number of issues that are conspiring to create an uneven playing field, if you will, particularly for Black people in the United States. I think that's clear. And I think that to create a successful effort to kind of change these characteristics, we have to deal with the whole problem. And frankly, companies didn't want to fail. I really think that companies wanted to succeed at that effort, but they failed at that effort because they didn't have the skill sets to do the work in a way that would drive success. They didn't put the programs in place. They didn't create the mentorship. They didn't know what to do. I think we know a lot more today across industries. There's been quite a bit of research in terms of what a company needs to do to create a safe, constructive workplace for Black people, for women, for everybody, and to get the benefits of it. And so I do think that we can do it differently now than than the results that we got a decade ago. So I'm optimistic. And again, I think it's generally skill gaps and failure to reach back in and address system level problems.
But this failure, it belongs to boards, but it also belongs to the ESG movement itself, right? Like Calvert's done a lot of work around supporting diversity efforts, and even you yourself have acknowledged that the numbers are still too low.
Yeah, well, I got that question today from this board that we're talking to, because they read what I said, and I think, well, the whole investment industry is a laggard, but the other piece of the equation is research. And going back to points that Andrew has made, we've got to be able to do this in a way that works within our economic system, that works within our capitalist system. We have to bring the numbers, bring the research, and bring the data to the table. And that is really the responsible investment community, the ESG research community. That's where we need to take responsibility, because when we engage with companies, we have to bring the numbers. We also have to bring the best practices. We have to recognize that we have a problem, and part of the problem is many companies don't have the right practices in place to manage this work environment constructively, and they're missing the opportunity, they're perpetuating the problem. So it's not just asking companies to do this, it's a big job. There's a pretty large lift ahead of us. And so, what do we need to do differently this time so we don't suffer the failures in the past? And I think, again, it's research, connecting the economics, bringing the best practices, dealing with the board. It's a number of things that need to be done. It's a hard job.
Andrew, do you want to jump in here?
I did want to add something, because I know we have so many financial journalists on this call, and I think that financial journalism and journalism broadly has done a pretty rotten job of creating diversity, specifically in the financial journalism community. And it's systemic. It's systemic from the beginning, and we can go back and talk about education, all sorts of things, but it's also, it was for so many decades and years. And by the way, I was a beneficiary of this. It was free internships because, by the way, training costs money. Training is not a free product. And so those of us like myself who were blessed to be in a position to take a free internship were able to get ahead in ways that other people can't. I've spent the last 20 years of my life at the New York Times. Up until several years ago, when we established the David Carr Fellowship, we were not really hiring people directly out of college. That was something we would never do. We weren't really in the business of training people. We were hiring people when they were 25, 30, 35, after they had had experience. And you were looking, therefore, for journalists who had experience, who had sources, who had the package. But we were effectively outsourcing the training to others, and nobody else was doing it. And so and then we look around and we say, why aren't these newsrooms look diverse enough? Well, I think there's a reason for it. And so the only thing I would say is to do these things are not just, you don't have to be just well-intentioned. You have to be willing to actually spend money and time and energy to do them. And I think that the investors and Johns of the world need to prove that the time and energy and money that's going to be spent to do these things is worth that money. Especially, by the way, in industries like journalism, where these have been relatively genuinely challenged businesses over the last decade or two. And so there's not been lots of money lying around to do lots of other things with. And so there are lots of reasons, and I'm not rationalizing why we're here in this moment, except to articulate why I think we've gotten to this place and what the opportunity and white space is for us to fix it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now I just want to flip to a question that came from one of our audience members. This is Laura Keller, who's also on the board of NIFWA. She said, on those EEOC forms that companies send to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, should the SEC step in to mandate that public companies release these? similar to how the agency did many years ago regarding uniform disclosure of the compensation paid to named executive officers.
Olivia, there's an active debate going on in the chat there about this, I think, and respectful of all that. There's 2 or 3 follow-ons that are really interesting. We should all read that. So I think companies need to do it on their own. And I'm not a fan of asking the SEC to mandate this particular disclosure. There's a comment in here about risk if companies don't do this. And turning back to something Andrew said about the impact of social media, I can tell you that there are apps being created for people to disclose this to. So I just don't know how companies are going to maintain this secret. I don't know why a company would want to take the risk of trying to maintain the secret in an environment where if you don't create transparency, transparency can get created for you very quickly. So I don't think the SEC should have to mandate it. I'm not a fan of that. And I think that from an investor, it will be a much more important piece of information to know who's doing this voluntarily versus who won't do this and who gets it done to them. That's going to tell us a lot about the culture of that organization and what's happening on the inside.
And Andrew, do you think it should be mandated? No.
No, I'm not a fan of mandates. I think that there will be a market pressure or not for these numbers. Look, as a journalist, I want as much transparency as possible. So I'm always advocating for more. Do I think that it should be private? I don't know. I mean, if you want to keep it private and you think that benefits you, great. But as I think John just said, I think that people like myself and many of the people on this call, I see, Peter Coy and so many of my other friends. If we want to make it transparent, I think we'll make it our jobs and livelihood to do that. And so we'll see.
So another question on mandates, what about the idea of quotas? Some believe that they're necessary to break entrenched racism and others think that they're actually a negative. Some companies have enforced quotas in recent weeks, like Airbnb. It's pledged that 20% of its board and executive committee will be people of color by the end of 2021. I'd like you both to weigh in on whether or not racial quotas should be enforced across corporate America. Andrew, do you want to start?
I have very mixed views of this. I think the biggest issue is how quickly you can find the right talent. I think that's a huge issue right now. I'll tell you, every talented African-American friend of mine who's working today, his phone is ringing off the hook. And that's a great thing. And I'm so glad that their phone is ringing off the hook. But I also think that in the process of this, especially as we try to do this and hopefully do this fast, there will be mistakes made along the way. And what I don't want to happen is there to be so many mistakes made along the way that it potentially sets back any of these efforts. So despite our ADD and impatience, I think that we have to have some patience. I know that that may be an unsatisfactory thing to say. I think the other big thing that's going to be very difficult for leaders and managers is persuading. And this is a very sensitive topic to talk about, and get out the smallest violin you have, because you're going to be hearing this from a middle-aged white man. I think persuading staff and teams that this is the right thing to do, and not just the right thing to do, but maybe at the expense of employees that have been there and worked there for a long time. Because there are people who invariably have worked, have been trying to climb this ladder, think that they've climbed this ladder, and think that they're supposed to get to the next rung. And you know what? They're not. And this is not a situation about growing the pie. There is a binary element to this to some degree. And so, but persuading people that it is actually in their interest, in society's interest, and ultimately in all of our interest to do this, I think is going to be a real challenge that oftentimes doesn't get talked about enough.
I mean, there's also the issue of if someone is hired onto a board, what about the assumption that they're hired into that position because of their race rather than the fact
There's always the issues of tokenism and the like. Yes, I mean, these are that's why I said these are very, very complicated issues, and also, as I said, sensitive issues. Given that, I have to say, in this environment, I hope, like this phone call, I hope we can have I hate to use the phrase safe space, but a space where we can all have a conversation.
Okay.
Yeah, John, you're shaking your head.
But I think also this has become a complicated.
I appreciate, Andrew, all the things you said, and it's important to hear all that. I think for all of us, understand that. I work with a team that's 50% of my people are people of color, and we happen to be 50-50 male female at the firm. In my experience, in life and in business, is we actually have plenty of talented Black people to do the jobs. They're just not given the opportunity. And we have plenty of talented Black people to be on boards. They're just not given the opportunity. I'm not a buyer of the concept that we have an issue of putting people who aren't qualified into these roles or any of that. I really think we've got a problem in the country that's racism. And I think that exists. It's real. In many cases, it's not a bad person being overtly racist. It's a good person who's been brought up in a racist country, who's never been exposed to lots and lots of Black people who are enormously talented and skilled, and they just don't get it. And that's just the reality of the United States of America. And that's why if we can solve this and change it, things are going to be better for everybody. And I agree with what Andrew said. There's a lot of people who don't get that. They don't understand it. It's going to be a surprise to them. It's going to hurt them. And they're going to have to unlearn a whole lot of stuff that they learned in this country, or they learned at the company that they work for. But it's time to do that. And so I really think that, and you mentioned earlier, hey, the financial journalists need to step up. That's probably true. I haven't thought a lot about that. But I would just, in thinking about it here right now, if you do step up, let's lead the way and show the great things that some companies are doing. Let's focus on talking about the things that companies are doing that work, get best practices out there. Because what I said earlier is there's a lot of companies that have been working hard at this and have made a little bit of progress. So in addition to looking and saying, hey, we've got a failure on our hands here, 10 years of effort didn't really work, but there's lots of examples where it did work. There's lots of good stories out there. There's lots of knowledge that's been built. We need to amplify that. We need to get that out there, because I believe that there's many, many, many people who want to do this the right way, who want to end racism in the country. And if we can show them the examples where it's working, where it's happening, we've got some momentum right now. We can actually crack this code and move it.
Mm-hmm. So you've both mentioned financial journalists needing to step up. So I'd like to just turn the conversation to the role of the media here. How do you think that the media has covered the Black Lives Matter movement? Are we covering it the right way, the wrong way? Is there anything we're missing, or what should we be doing differently? Andrew, do you want to take this first, given that you are a financial journalist as well?
No, I actually want to hear what this is a consumer feedback question for me. I want to hear what the consumer thinks. What does John say?
Well, I think the media must have done something right, because I mean, I'm at least realistic enough to say, you guys tell me what the world looks like, right? And I generally see the world through what the media tells me. And I think the media has covered this pretty darn well. And I think it's been a pretty good showing to this point, to this point. And I think we're probably at the end of the beginning of this coverage, right? And I guess the question is really, where is the media going to go with it from here? Is it going to fade? Was this just a big extended news cycle and we're done and we're going to get on to the election and the campaign? Or, is this a substantive theme in a vertical that's going to be big. And you've seen the media come and go on sustainability and climate change. I mean, it's taken hold, but it started, it stopped. Anyhow, I think the coverage has been good, and you asked this question earlier. This question came up about the good examples of companies, and the media is not buying it, right? I mean, companies are saying, "Oh, we've got COVID-19 nailed. We're doing great things for our people," or we really believe in the Black Lives Matter, important of it, and they're saying stuff. The media generally, and the financial media in particularly, is just not buying that story, which I think is great. And so I think the media is so tremendously important at this moment, and has generally done a pretty good job.
Okay, so John, you think we're doing an okay job. Andrew, what about you?
I think we're doing an okay job. I'm never satisfied with the job we're doing. I don't have a particularly great answer. I have to apologize. As you were speaking, John, I started looking down into the chat and saw a question that I think figures into where you were going with this, Olivia. So if we'll indulge David Grinberg, who asked, is it disingenuous for the media, this is the issue that John's talking about, to investigate corporate diversity when media diversity is likewise badly lacking, especially at management levels? And I think the answer is no, it's not disingenuous. For many years, I've written very critically about companies with dual class shares, and invariably, the CEO of the company calls me up and says, "Sorkin, what are you doing? You work for a company with dual class shares." I don't think there's anything disingenuous about it. I think that that's what makes a market and what makes a free press. And I think these are important issues that need to be discussed. And as much as I think media companies would love to be role models, and I think that's a nice goal, I don't necessarily think we have to be unto ourselves to investigate and comment on and provide perspective and analysis and news on topics that may that we unto ourselves may not be as good at.
In recent weeks, we've seen a racial reckoning occurring inside US newsrooms as well, including at the New York Times. Journalists have spoken out against editorial decisions regarding racial issues, pay inequities, a lack of people of color in positions of power, as you just mentioned. Often as we work as journalists, we want to expose diversity failures, as we were just discussing, but now it seems like journalists are looking internally at their own newsrooms and don't really like what they see. How do you think that the tension inside newsrooms is going to impact coverage and the wider public discussion about race in America?
Well, I think at the New York Times, it's clearly, I think you see it in the pages. I think the conversation in our newsroom has opened up a larger conversation, both about what we need to do internally in terms of more diversity, both in management and in just the newsroom across the board. And so, hopefully over time, we have more voices at the table, more diverse voices who bring a diversity of perspective that therefore is infused into the paper. I think in the very, very immediate term, you're seeing it in the coverage, but I think there's lots. I think the great part about this moment is that, despite the cancel culture element on one side where people think that, I know there's a view that certain voices that some of the voices are narrowing, and that may be true too on one side. The aperture is also opening on another side. So I think you have to look at it in various ways right now.
And I'd also just love to discuss different policies that are coming out of newsrooms right now. Like we've seen Bloomberg, for example, has decided it's going to capitalize B for black and capitalize W for white. I think the New York Times only capitalizes black, which is similar to the Wall Street Journal. John, I wonder, do you think that changes like this being made inside media companies really mean anything? Or do you think it's similar to kind of just noise coming out of organizations that make these Twitter statements and don't actually change anything?
Well, I think it's an outcome of the tension that you're talking about. And Andrew has been, I'd say, courageous in talking about kind of the risks that everybody's taking just dealing with this and talking about it. So does it, it's a signal, it's a sign more than something, a capital B or a capital W, the absence of it isn't the thing. It is that people are focused on the issue. It's a signal of the importance of the matter and the debate that's happening. And I think the seriousness that our entire society is placing on the issue. So I think it's a sign of change that's important. And in that respect, I think it is meaningful, and it is important, and it is reflective of the level of debate and seriousness that's going on. And it's very public. It's very public.
Andrew, do you want to add to that?
I agree with John. I think it's more than just capitalizing a letter or I think I think this is a moment, and I think, to the extent that we're the first draft of history, I think people will write history books, and this will be part of it.
So I really want to touch on the technology industry for a moment here. Bloomberg recently wrote a story about how Silicon Valley is such a casually racist place that Black CEOs are regularly advised to hire a white person to sit in business meetings and just be white. I'd love to hear what you both think about the responsibility of venture capitalists in ending racism in America. Does it differ from corporations?
So I have a very strong view about this. Can I weigh in?
Please.
So, and I think this goes to the systemic nature of the challenge that we face. If you really think about how a company is formed in its infancy, oftentimes, especially out in Silicon Valley, but elsewhere as well, it's with a roommate, it's with a dorm, it's in a dorm, or it's with a friend. It's a person or two people or three people who happen to be at a Starbucks, and they get an idea and they decide to put it together. And this is where it's complicated, because it may be that two guys are roommates together, or two women are roommates together, and maybe they'll be the same race, maybe they won't be the same race. But I think it's incumbent on the venture capitalists and those that are seeding and investing in these companies to make sure that early on in the infancy of these businesses, when they're being created, that diversity is a component of it from the get-go. Because part of the problem is that these companies start one way. As I said, it could be that they're, 3 or 4 male friends who start a company together. And then before you know it, we're talking about tech bros, and there's 50 people at the company. And so I think it's incumbent. I think venture capitalists actually do have a responsibility, but I'd call it an opportunity, really, to make it clear that part of the investment thesis from the get-go is to make sure what the culture looks like from a diverse perspective, so that they're not dealing with this issue when the company's about to go public, and all of a sudden these companies have to pretend as if there's something that they're not, and you see them all of a sudden bringing in one female board member at 3 days before the IPO.
John, do you have any thoughts?
I second Andrew's statement about the level of importance in the United States. I mean, technology is very much defines our competitive edge relative to the rest of the world. It's enormously important to this country, and if we don't solve it in VC and private equity, private equity is different, but in both cases, you've got an entity that has enormous power. The VC fund, the PE fund, they've got the money, and generally speaking, they define the governance structure of that early company, and they decide, of those people who came together in Starbucks and had a great idea, who gets the mentorship, who gets the guidance. Sometimes we say, oh, that's when the adults came in the room, right? And they made that company. They're VC investors, but they made that company. And we know that happens. So I would go to governance also here, and putting in place the governance early on. And that is something that the VC players have a very, very broad reach on, very big control on. Same with PE firms. There's so many companies that tree up to a small number of private equity firms. And so we can't talk about solving things in corporate America without paying really significant attention to VC and PE in addition to our public companies.
What do you think about like how Silicon Valley companies have responded to the racial tensions? We've seen a lot of them coming out, speaking out against speaking out in support of Black Lives Matter. And then there have been news stories looking at their own diversity numbers and how they haven't moved in years. Like some as little as like 1-2% of their employees are African American. And we've also seen a lot of these companies trying to boost diversity numbers in the past by adding contract workers, and you're including janitors and kitchen staff into your overall numbers to try and say that you're a diverse workforce. How do you feel about
Well, in fact, some of the big tech companies actually provide pretty good disclosure relative to companies in other sectors because they had such a problem with inequality in gender. And they got in trouble for it. They got called out on it, and they began to provide some disclosure. They made a little bit of progress on gender, but they also gave us information about race, and they made almost no progress on getting Black people in those roles. So I think you asked me, how do I feel about their response? They're saying the right things, but again, this is going to come down to implementation. I think we have a time here where either between what companies said at Business Roundtable, they made these great statements. All these companies are saying all the right things. You better believe all that's coming through the legal team, the PR team, et cetera. No one's saying anything without having it carefully vetted. We got a whole bunch of statements. We have a moment to ask companies to put the systems in place to make it happen. So you can look back right now at the tech industry and said, you told us you were going to improve diversity a decade ago, back to what you said earlier, Olivia. You didn't get it done. We need some more details this time. You said even more this time. We need the details. And I think that's where the system comes together. And I think that's where we have to take a kind of a helpful role and get the good stories out there, get the best practices out there. There aren't a lot in Silicon Valley, unfortunately.
So my final question is just, how do we make sure that this isn't just a phase, and that when the news cycle moves on and Black Lives Matter is no longer in the headlines, that companies don't turn to other issues and their diversity promises are forgotten?
I'll take it as the journalist. I think the issue is we have to make sure that we continue to hold companies accountable. I think that's a huge part of the job. And the question is, you're right, in a crazy news cycle, come October, November, are we going to be focused on this? We may not be, but are we going to be focused? Can we be focused on this in January and March? Can on a quarterly basis? That's the question. On a quarterly basis, can we actually put metrics behind this and report regularly on where people, where companies are? I think we can. I think the big question is how fast all of this happens. I think this is all part of a journey. Some people want it to be faster. Some people want it to be slower. Some people want it to be medium. I don't know what temperature you want it to be on, but we should be measuring it. And I think the question is the frequency of the measurement and sort of how regularly and there's a commitment to actually doing it.
And John, do you have any final comments that you'd like to add there?
Well, I think what Calvert has kind of made the commitment to increase our engagement with companies. We're in that cycle. We're on the move. These are things that play out over at a minimum of a year. It's a convenient time for all this to happen because we're just finishing proxy voting season, just getting the annual general meetings out of the way, and we've got a whole year from now until the next set of proxies and votes and director elections. So we've got our plan laid, we've got our action happening, we're on the move, and I think this is going to happen. I don't know what the media will do because hopefully we're going to get into the tedious, grind it out, actually do stuff, do work, as opposed to kind of the fireworks part of things. So we know what we think we need to do to make it happen. We're building coalitions. We're working with other large investors, and we're substantially engaged with large companies on the issue. And we can't turn back. I mean, we're out of the gate. We're doing things. We've got stuff in motion. So there's no chance we back off.
Right. So it's a watch this space then. Well, I see we've gone over by 10 minutes, and I just want to say a huge thank you to both of our panelists, Andrew and John. You were amazing, and it was a really insightful conversation. So I appreciate it. And
thank you. Olivia, thank you. I need to just do 2 shots to Olivia, who worked with me on a story last year, and we had such a ball doing it. And so I'm so glad that we do this together. And I see Claudia Deutsch on here, and I miss working with you so much, Claudia. I just want to say hello.
Thanks, Andrew. And before we sign off, I just want to throw the floor over to my fellow board member, Conway, who wants to introduce our next event, which is in 2 weeks, and it's going to continue this conversation.
Hello, everybody. On July 28th at 7 o'clock, we are going to pick up from where you guys left off. I know we spent about 20 minutes talking about the media and the role of media in terms of reporting on race and equality, but on July 28th, we're going to spend a whole hour discussing that topic, also going a little bit further into the whole idea of what's going on inside of newsrooms and how people of color like me feel about working in a newsroom where you're usually the only Black person and not anybody who looks like you who has any power. So we're going to have Kadia Tubman, who's a news editor at Insider, James Blue, who's the senior producer of special events at the PBS NewsHour, and we're going to have Trevor Honeycutt, who's the 2020 campaign reporter, or one of the 2020 campaign reporters for Reuters. So we have wire service, we got new media, we got TV. We're going to cover the whole landscape. So at 7 p.m. here on Zoom on July 28th.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Conway, and thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you.